The first of the Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. In the second teaching, His Holiness the Dalai Lama begins to expand upon this truth as the foundation for the other three. What is suffering, and in particular, what is meant by the Sanskrit term dukkha in Buddhism? It's often said falsely about Buddhism that it sees all life as suffering. From the fact that Buddha said, all this is suffering, people infer that Buddhism is radically life-denying. In fact, Buddha never said all life is suffering. He only said the unenlightened life is suffering. He went on to say, more importantly, that the enlightened life is bliss. It is nirvana, free of suffering. He himself experienced a boundless energy, a perfect bliss. Buddha never said he still suffered. So Buddhism is very optimistic about our prospects. It urges us, of course, to confront the suffering attendant upon our ignorance. It encourages us that we can find true happiness once we develop wisdom. Buddhism helps us to notice that pleasurable experiences are temporary. Pleasurable occurrences exist only in relation to the background of our experience. If we look at that background, we find that we are born in pain, die in pain, and in between are subject to illness, hunger, and the effects of the elements, not to mention our increasing decrepitude as we grow older. The background of our life's experience is indeed a basic form of suffering. It's called the suffering of change. The Dalai Lama points out that suffering prevails no matter which realm of existence we are dwelling in, be it the desire realm of the senses, the form realm of intellectual pursuits, or the formless realm of advanced meditational states. As long as we appropriate experience from the self-centered perspective, driven by misunderstanding our true nature, we are doomed to frustration. Because of our fundamental self-centered ignorance at the root of our consciousness, we react to the conditions of our existence with a kind of selfish desire that produces all kinds of other afflictive emotions. These afflictive emotions can be compared to the 7 deadly sins. But it is the fundamental ignorance at the heart of our existence, our misperception of the absoluteness of ourself, that gives rise to these afflictive emotions and prevents us from realizing the lasting joy and happiness that we all seek. So, at the basis of suffering, self-seeking ignorance is the first link in a causal chain that the Buddha called the chain of dependent origination. Once we have a good grasp of the nature of suffering, we clearly see the start of the chain, which is the second truth, the origin of suffering.
All right. That don't get about it. That device age, Dambasa, and Kualanda, Dumda, and Kabargi, Kuala Medayore. And that is Shamiluse. Marship's house, Maritan Gimdula, in Majamati, Bambos, Shashan
Now, talking about the Four Noble Truths, the first one is, of course, the truth of suffering. And here, the sort of the usage of this term, truth, in context of the four four factors, it seems that according to different philosophical schools, there is a different interpretation of this word truth. But I'm not going to touch that, partly because I myself do not remember all of this, and partly because it is going to complicate my explanation. So in dealings with complex issues like that, perhaps the best sort of response is to adopt a dignified silence.
오늘 이렇게 하긴 뭐. 다게 전대 세브지디다 내가 지들이 den시미다서 주로 무슨도 통해 소소기고 요새지. den시 무슨도 통마통도 통해 소소기고다 파괴 인식까지 텐주를 여지던 게 야말이. 좀더 어머들이 인식했던 게
One of the reasons why I pointed out this complexity in the understanding of this term truth in relation to the Four Noble Truths is because there is a fundamental difference between, say, Madhyamaka Prasangika school and mainstream Buddhist schools as to how one distinguishes between ordinary beings and Arya beings, the superior beings. The mainstream Buddhist schools makes the distinction on the basis of whether or not the individual practitioner has gained direct, intuitive insight into the Four Noble Truths, a criteria which the Madhyamaka Prasangikas do not accept, because according to Madhyamaka Prasangika school, even non-Arya beings, ordinary beings, can have direct, intuitive realizations of the Four Noble Truths.
Jenida, Dunga Shayun, the condition was Lavina, Rangu, and Lanyu Kunjun Le Getting. That was Nigeria, Takadazawa, Dunga dancing in Chilia, and Dunga Damas, that's all things. That Delia, she nerd, not Jew, Peshinjasha.
So, what exactly is the meaning of dukkha or suffering? Here, suffering or dukkha is that which is the basis of our experience of painful experiences. And in brief, dukkha refers to our state of existence as conditioned by karma and delusions, or karma and afflictive emotions. So in Asanga states in Abhidhamma Sammucca that dukkha can be, the concept of dukkha, the concept of true dukkha or the truth of suffering must embrace both the environment where we live and also the individual beings living within it. So when we talk about the environment in which the individual, unenlightened individual beings live in, then here Buddhism talks about its cosmogony of the three realms of existence, the kama dhatu, and desire realm, formless realm, and form realms. The difficulty here is how to try to sort of conceptually understand. The point here is how to conceptualize this Buddhist concept of the three realms of existence. How can we conceive, for example, like form realms and formless realms? Of course, we cannot say that Buddha has talked about this in the scriptures. That alone is not a sufficient reason for a Buddhist to accept the existence of these realms. Perhaps sort of the most sort of comprehensible way of looking at the Buddhist concept of the three realms is one fundamental Buddhist sort of approach, that is to understand states of existence in terms of levels of consciousness or levels of mind. For example, like within, according to Buddhism, the very distinction between enlightened existence and unenlightened existence has to be understood on the basis of the level of mind or level of consciousness. The individual who is within a state of existence where the consciousness or the mind is unenlightened, or consciousness, the mind is undisciplined and untamed, that is a state of samsara. And someone who is within the state of being which has consciousness that is disciplined, attained, and enlightened. That is a nirvanic state of being. Similarly, in Buddhism, we also find the distinction that is made between ordinary beings and Arya beings or superior beings, again on the basis of the level of consciousness or level of realization. An individual who has gained direct intuitive realization of emptiness or the ultimate nature of reality is said to be Arya being or superior being, and someone who hasn't gained that realization is said to be ordinary being. So similarly, we can look at this division into three realms of existence, desire realm, form realm, and formless realm, in terms of the levels of consciousness in their causes. The subtler the level of consciousness that the individual attains, the subtler the realms of existence that the individual can attain.
자상가 치다 소소 이니 가서도 데베 처리야 되는 데베 연대는 템베 즉 초대와 롱지아요다 초대와 조된데 초대와 되는 즉 현자로 조여된 지기 데발이야 레서리요다 딘데부코에 딘데기다 가서래 딘데기 튕긴스님들이 그래 나다로 여된 지기 단 데베 감사직시.
So we can look at the concept of the three realms from that point of view, sort of relating that concept to the idea of levels of consciousness or levels of being within one's mind. For example, in our ordinary states of being, if the individual's sort of the mode of being is very much sort of within the context of attachment, sort of developing attachment towards perceptible objects, like say desirable forms or pleasant sort of sensations and so on. So these and having attachment towards these more kind of physical levels of experiences, and these sort of gross levels of interaction and thought processes and sensory experiences sort of lead to a form of existence which is sort of confined within the desire realm in the future as well. Similarly, there could be an individual who may have, in some sense, transcended the sort of attachment towards sort of immediately perceptible objects of perception, such as desirable forms or sounds or whatever, but rather is attached more towards more inner dimensions of sort of joy, like sort of not so much physical sensations, but is more attached towards internal kind of joys or states of joy or bliss. And that type of sort of individuals lead sort of create causes that would lead them to future rebirths where the very physical existence is in a much more refined form. Similarly, there could be individuals who have, again, not only transcendent attachment towards more physical sensations, but also towards pleasurable, any form of pleasurable or pleasurable sort of sensations or joy, but rather is aiming more towards a state of equilibrium or equanimity, and that kind of way of sort of course, that level of consciousness is much subtler compared to the others, but still there is a form of attachment towards a particular mode of being. So that states of mind can lead to what is known as the fourth level of, the grosser levels of that can lead to the fourth level of form realm, and then the subtler attachment towards these states of equanimity or equilibrium leads to the formless realms. So there is a way of looking at the three realms, sort of relating to them to levels of consciousness.
다한테 네 나다 지금 청지 차리디 다 당감다 일단 대배 네 맞아 가서 민지견 민지견다 엔드네만 달을 루난 게 그래 계셔집시 숨주서 숨 다 그러고 탑재배 삼대 말만 그래 쟤는 어떤 삼대 당분 입어서 뭐 따라해 삼대 10회 있으면 위하면 쟤 삼대 민지기 삼대 당부 면체 춘지기 삼대 입은 면체 롱지기 삼대 숨은 면체 10회 요하면 나도 그러면 전에 시한도 쓰리 또 달라이 미미신 알아야 돼 전에한테 리로서 어디 전에 따따다 대고 말해 지금 인데 차지 이거 따다나 봐 그 간다지 네 주산네 그 견다비 우와 나 지금은 가서 주고 배는 인데 차로 차잖아 인데 태면으로 차잖아 딱고 뭔가 중니 셔셔에 차들을 따다배 겨인데 지기 거기서 무슨거다 그 차셔에 통은 거 민주잖아요 그뒤 차네 이 중니 셔셔고 따다면 되겠다 서비스
So, based on this cosmogony of sort of the three realms of existence, Buddhism talks about the process of universe, sort of infinite process of universe coming into being, and sort of going through a process of extinction, and dissolution, and disappearance, and then again coming into being. So that process has to be understood in relation to the three realms of existence. And according to Abhidharma literature, which talks about the metaphysics and cosmology in the Buddhist discourses, it is from the third levels of form realm downwards, that is subject to this continuous process of coming into being and destruction and dissolution. And whereas from the fourth state of form realm onwards, which also includes the formless realm, they are outside this process of coming into being and this, sort of this evolution of the physical universe, one could say. So, and this this kind of infinity of the process of evolution that the physical universe goes through is very related to the question which came up earlier about the question of Big Bang and its relation to Buddhist cosmology. One thing I can say is that if the understanding of the scientific cosmological theory of Big Bang entails an acceptance of only one Big Bang as the beginning, then of course that would not go well with the basic Buddhist cosmology. Then if that is the case, then Buddhists would have to kind of bite their nails and sort of come up with some way of understanding how it would not contradict the Buddhist idea of the evolutionary process of universe. However, if the concept of Big Bang does not entail there being only one Big Bang, the beginning, rather if one can accept multiplicity of sort of Big Bangs, then of course that would go very well with the basic Buddhist understanding of evolutionary process.
아다 민지 춘지 룽지 디디 삼대 당원이 무슨 사야디 아다 빨리 아비다만 무슨거나 그리 찍고 있나?
Sorry, I forgot to translate earlier. His Holiness was talking about how much of this discussion is based on the Abhidharma literature, and this very idea of sort of evolutionary, evolution of the physical universe, going through an infinity of the process of dissolution and evolution, that is in the Abhidharma literature. But having said that, whatever is in Abhidharma literature need not necessarily be accepted as literal, because we know that the cosmology in Abhidharma, particularly the sort of the cosmology of our universe, according to the Abhidharma, is based on the model of this idea of a Mount Meru in the middle with the four continents around it. And also we find that many of the descriptions of the size of the sun and the moon, which we find in Abhidharma literature, is directly against, contrary or contradictory to the scientific discussions, explanations of these facts. So in which case one would have to conclude given that scientific experiments have proven these claims to be wrong, that we will have to accept the conclusion of the science on these points.
전에 다와 파 지금 전부리 차당다 디디 가다지 용어 시团에다 나갑집에 있는 용에 때문에 아니 봐 청지시대야지 디야 규라면 나로네 송여래 전에 간다 디디 세리 시야다고 잘했어.
So what we find is that in Buddhism there is an understanding of sort of a conception of a cosmology where the evolution of physical universe is understood in terms of the processes of the four elements, the fire, water, wind, and earth. And if one can sort of add on space as an element, then there is 5 elements. And there is a complex discussion of that, not only in the Abhidhamma, but also in the Uttara Tantra, the Sublime Continuum as well. And these descriptions or explanations seem to be very similar to the scientific sort of theories of cosmology, explanations. So this is how Buddhism understands the evolution of the physical universe, or one could say the environment. Then when talking about the beings, the sentient beings that inhabit these environments, then of course there is an acceptance of multiplicity of sentient beings within the Buddhist world.
숙미다 숙제니 다 숙제래 숙차라 근데 아주 전부 다가간 차샤네 다 아주 통슈 아주 통투하게 시류 대제가 공부 시류서를 다 가다지 라베숙 예등에 그지 라베숙 매등에 스피릿인데 근데 그 મં구지다 예대입니다.
So within the realm of the sentient beings, of course there is an acceptance of sentient beings with corporeal forms and sentient beings who could be perceived as formless. And within even within the sort of our sort of familiar world, in Buddhism there is an acceptance of diversity of sentient beings, many of which are perceptible to our sensory faculties, and then some which are not so obvious to our sensory faculties. For example, like the spirit world.
Jenny, certainly, the deities live in the Jigdembe Hasle. I'm the Chibuchiburi. And the spirit did, Ejan, I'm the Chibuchiburi. Jidajana, Mazul Dore, John, Danish and members. Should be thinking Shaman, within Shani.
So, generally speaking, in Buddhism, according to Buddhist understanding, that human form is considered to be one of the most ideal forms of existence because of its suitability or because of its conduciveness for practicing Dharma. So compared to the human form of existence, the spirit form would be in fact considered inferior because of its less effectiveness in pursuing the practice of Dharma. Of course, as sort of members of this sort of beings in the spirit world, they may have certain faculties or powers that are not open to us, like sort of certain powers of precognition or maybe some kind of supernatural powers. But the fact remains that they are parts of this world, where human beings also live.
대탐제로 뇽배 샹완제
And so all of these sentient beings are under the control of delusions, under the control of afflictive emotions and thoughts. And they are, in some sense, one could say, products of delusions and afflictive thoughts and emotions. Lama Tsongkhapa sort of quite gives a vivid description of the state of being in samsara. So I suppose the unenlightened existence of sentient beings in samsara. He gives the analogy of someone being sort of tied together very tightly by the ropes of karma, negative karma, and delusions, and afflictive emotions and thoughts, and then put within this and sort of being encased in this net of very tightly bound sort of net of sort of ego consciousness and sort of self-grasping attitudes, and then being sort of thrown around sort of aimlessly by the torrents, sort of, by the currents of fluctuating experiences of suffering and pain. And that is the characteristic of an unenlightened existence. So the question is, if that is the case, what is dukkha? What is the suffering? So Buddhism talks about 3 levels of suffering. One is the suffering of suffering, or one could say obvious sufferings. And the second one is sufferings of change. And the third one is a suffering of conditioning. So when we talk about suffering at the level of the first type, which is the suffering of suffering, we are talking in very conventional terms of experiences that we can all identify as sufferings. These are painful experiences. So when we talk about suffering of suffering, here we are principally talking about, in Buddhism, 4 main experiences of suffering, which are all considered to be fundamentally in the state of being in suffering. These are the suffering of birth, suffering of sickness, and aging, and death. And the significance of the recognition of these states as suffering, or these experiences as suffering, as a kind of an impetus or catalyst towards a spiritual quest, is very strongly demonstrated in Buddha's own personal life story. Buddha, as a Prince Siddhartha, according to the story, is supposed to have seen suffering of a sick person, and an old person, and a dead sort of person being carried away, and these sort of sights is supposed to have led him to the realization that so long as he cannot free himself from this infinite process of rebirth, infinite process of birth, he will always be subject to the other sufferings. So this has led, and then seeing a spiritual aspirant is supposed to have led the Buddha to the full recognition or awareness that there is a possibility of a freedom from this cycle of suffering. In Buddhism, there is an understanding that so long as you are subject to the process of rebirth, that all the other sufferings are in some sense kind of natural consequences of that initial starting point. So one could say that one's life is characterized within the sort of the cycle of birth and death, sort of sandwiched in between are various sufferings of illness and aging.
다들 교회 동에서 대하리 나는 유다 용라 디기디다 가랑 아주 사실 대화마다 야만다 가라 사실 대화 인신이 교회 동에서.
So the second level of suffering, the suffering of change, refers to experiences which ordinarily we would identify as pleasurable experiences, because in reality, so long as we are in an unenlightened state, all our joyful states or joyful experiences are contaminated, and therefore they are ultimately suffering.
대야니 동네 사실 동네 멍구치니 거라 동네 다마 거름네 아니 대왕만 받고 싶마도 아니 양다거나 대화지 말이지. 걔들 양다거나 대화지 뭐이나 동네기 줄을 지점 때문에 대처기 동네 집에 들어왔는 신 대화만 받지 강나 때는 영향이 주터라 지점 때문에 대처기 대화 집에 들어와는 뒤 누구도 가서.
The reason why Buddhism says that these supposedly pleasurable experiences are ultimately states of suffering is because, according to Buddhism, there is an understanding that we perceive them as states of pleasure, sort of experiences of pleasurable or joyful, only because in comparison to a sort of a painful experience, they tend to appear as almost like a sort of a relief. So, they are in some sense relative. Their pleasurable experience, sort of status, is only relative to a painful experience. Therefore, if there are truly sort of joyful states and joyful experiences, then just as the more we indulge in the sort of causes that lead to pain, the painful experiences increase. Similarly, the more we engage in the causes that give rise to these supposedly pleasurable experiences, then the pleasure or the joy should intensify, which is not the case.
In our daily life, for example, when we also have some good food, some good clothes, right? And some kind of
Ornaments.
Ornament here and here, sometimes here also. So you see, these as a short time to certain period. Oh, you really feel, this is something really marvelous. Oh, very good, very good, very good. And oneself also is deeply satisfied and also show to others. But then 1 day pass, 1 week pass, 1 month pass, then the same object to that, same object. But then you may get frustration. So that's the nature, that's the fact. And also fame. At the beginning, you may feel, happy. Now I have good name. Then again, as the time goes, then sometimes you feel frustration. Dissatisfaction. And a friend. Also, I think they introduce a sexual. Say, at the beginning, you almost become mad. Then I think the very the same factor eventually create hatred, fight, and worst case, killing, murder. So that's the nature. So every beautiful thing, every good thing, I mean, everything which we consider something
desirable.
Desirable. If you look, you see, closely, and time goes, most of these facts eventually give us suffering. So that's the second perspective.
Second level.
Then the third, now the fundamental thing. Why is it why is it that kind of nature? And the answer is because all these, happen due to ignorance. So the I think the very name ignorance is not comfortable, not good. So under the influence or under the control by the ignorance, there is no possibility to some kind of permanent state, right? Permanent state of happiness. So some kind of, trouble, some kind of problem always happen. Like
so long as we remain under the power of this ignorance or fundamental misapprehension or confusion, then the sufferings come about almost like one after another, like ripples on water.
두식 동네 송대야디 두식 동네들에 파시 송이 있었다. 두식 동네 또 조조다 가다 ခွဲ가서다 그래서 저 두식 동네 송대야다 디 양나 또 다음으로 또 레드 뉴몽베 샤왕도 두베 다치 다다 이니 동네 땡싱에 마음번 동네 등에 다들 신기 동네 침이 다 주칭에기 레드 뉴몽버 깨와리야 냉엘이 제수 제니 레드 뉴몽 깨야리 고프게 가소리 튼비기는 주칭이지 디니실이야다
So the third level of suffering or dukkha is in what is known as the suffering of conditioning. And this refers to the mere fact of our unenlightened existence, which is under the influence of, under the control or influence of this fundamental state of confusion, and also the negative karmas that this confusion give rise to. And the reason why it is called the conditioning, the suffering of conditioning, is because not only is this mere state of existence serve as the basis for our many painful experiences in this life, but also it serves as a basis to create causes and conditions for future sufferings as well.
So that delayada 남진의 순리하다 때다 쉽게 하자 버리셔. 타임이라고 삼다. 타임이라고. 다 타임이라고 돼. 컨디션스는 균진직거든요. 제 균진직거디 땅도 라베미다고 임말이. 타임이라고 해서도 계시계시 직도야. 이시에요.
So in order to counteract this the third level of dukkha, one of the most powerful antidotes is the one that is explained in Dhammakriti's Pramanavartika, which is to meditate on Sorry, I'll start again. In order to develop a deeper understanding of this third level of suffering that Buddhism talks about, this suffering of mere conditioned existence, one of the useful way of looking at this is the one that is described in Dhammakriti's Pramanavartika, where he... And also in Aryadeva's 400 verses on the middle way, where there is an emphasis on reflecting upon the subtle, transitory, or impermanent nature of reality.
미투베 겐 사바스테 런이 네베 겐세 아니 개징이 겐다 타나 아니 그 균디 가제 윤자 지루야. 근데디 고라 신중 규직을 규직 왕기 그 지루로 와. 다 계속 지야서야 돼. 루브 규신지 텐 그 계속
So when we talk about impermanence or transient nature of things, here it is important to bear in mind that there are again two levels of meaning here. One can understand impermanence in terms of how something comes into being and then stays for a while, then disappears. And that level of impermanence or transitoriness is something that could be quite easily understood. And also, that kind of destruction requires, one could say, a secondary condition. Something comes into being and then stays for a while. And when its I suppose lifespan, one could say, comes to an end, and another condition acts as a kind of a catalyst to destroy its continuity. But there is, however, a subtler understanding of the concept of impermanence or transient nature of things. This is the mere sort of effect of how everything goes through a dynamic process of change, that how everything is sort of momentarily changing, going through a process of momentary changes.
계직이 지켜야 돼. 강도 제발서나 깨버 코네. 계직이 지켜야 차도.
So this momentary changes, that the process of momentariness that all things go through is not because there is a further sort of secondary condition that makes things become momentary, but rather it is the very cause that led to the thing to come into being that is also the cause of its destruction. One could say that within the cause of its origin, there is also a cause of its cessation or destruction.
대양 계지 당부 계지 입에 두수 마대바디 예 차이메다고 시기하라 이제 조조디 계지 당부 령균이네 집에 주는 두신 거지.
So so this transient nature this momentary transient nature can not only be understood in terms of an entity, the first instance not staying, not enduring during its second instance or second moment, but also the fact that when the first instance comes into being, it is not static, it is moving towards its own cessation.
세상 같은 적이 다그 깨고 코네 지게 정신도 두대가 인도산에 깨지기 지게야디 친중 두시하나 때문에 정이 깨지기 두 코네 책이지.
So since everything comes into being right at the beginning, the very birth of things comes together with its seed or potential for its dissolution or destruction. So one could say that the destruction or cessation of things and events does not need a secondary further condition.
So today in Buddhism,
therefore, in Buddhism, all things or phenomena are said to be sort of other-powered. They are under the power of their causes. They are under the control of their causes.
디 지를 한도 셴. 귀 샹완지 임베 최예는 동행임베 캡더스가 말했대. 다 안다대. 제라도마 다 풍부감 마삼다인 거야. 다 풍부감 마삼다인데 풍부디 루야디 계식이 두. 디 샹완지. 땅을 안 좋아한다. 녀활로 풍부디 계식이 두 가르스는 말해 버렸어. 그래서 근데 인정 안 하는 풍부 머리에 샹왕도 예도시에서 머리에 샹왕도 예봐 주잖아요. 머리에 샹왕도 예봐 드시도 라와메바. 동네에는 신바. 다디 지시 머리고 마셔봐도 다 가다 동네들이 다들내도 차도. 다 감수도 씹어숨비. 네, 상당히 체지직 상당히 지금 그게 동네 문주고 지주로 예매 temple 켜봐 여봐서 마도 자와 다 집어서 가봐 여친절이야. 지시 머리고 상황도 여친절이야. 아니 과봐.
So once you have developed that sort of that kind of understanding of the transient nature of reality or phenomena, then you can situate your understanding of dukkha within that context, and then sort of reflect upon our existence, our aggregates of mind and body, our very existence as an individual in this samsaric world. We know that given that it is, it has come into being. It has come into being as a result of its own causes and conditions. Therefore, it must be also other-powered. It must be also under the control of the causal processes that gave rise to its coming into being. So in the case of, however, in the context of our own existence within the samsaric world, the causes that we are referring to here are nothing other than our fundamental confusion or marikpa or ignorance and the delusory states that the confusion give rise to. So we know that so long as we are under the domination or under the control of these fundamental confusion and the delusions and the afflictive emotions that the delusion give rise to, then there is no room for lasting joy or lasting happiness. Of course, within the three realms of existence, we can talk about comparatively sort of more joyful states of existence. We can talk about relatively joyful existence. But however, so long as we remain within this samsaric world, wherever we are, whether in the form realm, formless realm, or desire realm, so long as we remain under the power or domination of these twin forces, the fundamental confusion and the delusions that this confusion give rise to, there is no scope for lasting joy. And so ultimately, or in final analysis, we are in a state of suffering or dukkha. So that is the meaning of this third sort of understanding, third level of understanding of dukkha.
머리과 세네 민배나 머리배 뭐 쇼르잖아요. 맨날 샤이어래. 아다리 가서다 담이 뒤줄에 차라 먹지 예배 개발을 해 머리부터 샤이르잖아요. 맨날 개발이야래. 근데 지용기 머리과 세네 세고야고 나서 대원두기로 등에 두고 말 거야. 레디니 그 간다지 등에 민두신도 등에 영야지 가진 치고래. 몽바와 마셔도 세우셔다. 자서 그 머리과 세민 다시 야우도 딱다.
So although this fundamental ignorance, or I've been using the word confusion, the Sanskrit word is avidya, which literally means ignorance. Although according to different sort of interpretations of the fundamental Buddhist doctrine of anatma, or no self, there are different interpretations of what is meant by this avidya, or ignorance. However, the general meaning that is common to all of these schools is an understanding that there is an ignorance, a fundamental ignorance at the root of our existence. The reason is quite simple, because we all know that from our own experience, what we deeply aspire is to gain happiness, and what we try to avoid is to avoid suffering. However, our actions and our behavior leads to more suffering, and it does not lead to the lasting joy and happiness that we seek. So this must surely mean that we are operating within an ignorant sort of a way of thinking. So that is the fundamental confusion that is at the root of our existence.
다 미카샤리아 녀외동에 튼주동에 이다동에 된대양 삼나 셈리야 쿠체. 타이동에 다시 늘라 다음에 지금 강공의 타이동에 된대그 삼다는 아주 셈리야 시작 판도여도 된대용도 가버리. 야 리카샤리아 그는 나라티에 야 리를 찍디 하나님 미르된사디 아주 뭔들 디나네 미르된디 상고실 찍어래. 상고실 찍대세 류다가 딱개가 넣지 동에다 머리에 샹왕도 주고 삼단 용도 근데 다 작슈지야디 급도 들리면 다 현아도 다시면서 정도 왔습니다.
So when reflecting on the nature of dukkha, according to the Buddhist teachings, for some practitioners, of course, reflecting upon the sufferings in the specific realms, such as the realms of sort of hell-like realms or animal realm or preta realm, for some people, these reflections may, in fact, be very powerful to kind of motivate towards a deeper spiritual quest to attain freedom from suffering. However, for many other people, which includes myself, reflection upon our own human suffering perhaps is more effective. The fact that, although according to Buddhism, human form of existence is considered to be one of the most positive ones, where we have all the potentials to, perfect enlightenment and so on. Even then, the state of existence of a human life isn't that joyful. We are subject to sort of unavoidable sufferings of birth, death, aging, and sickness. And also, when you reflect upon the fact that our conditioned existence is under the influence or domination of this fundamental confusion, and also the delusory states of emotions and thoughts that the confusion gave rise to. Once you realize these facts, then for someone like myself, the recognition of the suffering or dukkha nature seems to be much more effective than thinking about sufferings of some other realms.
다 머리 비itengi 아니 두시로 소베다 텐데 하면디리 마 두야 손을 자네 아니 텐징 더크돌이야 단단데 디에베 디주 디케베 디케 강 머리 보여베 아니 강 머리 비itengi 두시 세 어다 송샤들이야 토미기 군중이 나로려 아니 겐숨샤 스나리 나가도스.
So in the Buddhist scriptures, when this causal process of how this fundamental confusion give rise to volitions, volitional acts, which then give rise to a birth in a samsaric world, within the sort of model of these 12 links in the chain of interdependent origination, Buddha, in one of the scriptures, stated that made three observations. One is that he said that because there is this, that ensued. Because this came into being, that came into being. And because there was fundamental ignorance, volitional acts came into being. So when commenting on that, on these three statements, Asanga, in his Abhidhamma Sammucca, has talked about three conditions, and I think understanding of that point would be quite useful here.
다 계속 가르쳤나? 아니 디에벤 딘중 소야티기 아니 요함에 비켄샤리 담레스 요함에 비켄샤리 가르쳤나? 아니 간다치 아주 진지 제대하디 그직 시지 여네 그걸 시지 여네 이는 그 진지 제인 거 아래 마다 직디니 지 로이요 나 지금 지대 제법 로이요 원도도 타네 쇼샤시 말레스 그걸 괜지 예바되게 아니 괜지듯이 요야샤레스.
So when commenting on the first statement, Asanga said that the statement of the Buddha that because there is this, because there is this, that came into, that also exists. Asanga stated that the significance of that statement is to tell us that all phenomena come into being because they have causes. It's not as if there's a kind of a, one could say, infinitive or causal chain. It's not as if there was a first sort of a beginning and then things came into being. So, therefore, Asanga referred to that observation or qualification as the first conditioning.
Then, that yeba jigi, yeba samshigi, geweya, never gewe chawa chitumodu tasumre. Never yamare. So, the name in this ane, gewe, rang dribu, gewe chawa chevala, rangi jang, dujin shene, gewe chukuyare. Then they do di gewe, di jiksen. That called yeba sambu choba. Kora rangi, du shene, gewe, any rangshi janjimbayina, din dribu shen kikuyares. That Dalai any Tommy Midabikins. Yeva something to your maris. Korani, Gigi Jigdone, Midabaranji Janjigi, any Kinji is.
When commenting upon the second statement that because this came into being, that the other comes into being as well, Asanga spoke about what he called the impermanent condition, the condition of being impermanent or quality of being impermanent. The significance is that just because something exists is not enough to produce an effect. In order for something to produce, to have the potential to produce an effect, that very entity or thing itself must be subject to causation. It must also come into being as a result of other causes. So there is this infinitive causes. So just because something exists, mere existence alone is not adequate for giving rise to consequences. So not only should the cause be existent, but also the cause should be impermanent. It should be subject to causation.
강 머리비 땡기 두시 세소야 되기 다 미다베 규경기 아니 대부 가야 다 가소래 기투그래서는 대용 말이지 두라랑 대부 반다 가이나야 대다 릭tumbe 규칙이 타니 기후르마도 다지 릭미 등기 줄에 끼기 말이지 그래 민주산에 아니 코 두지 두시래디 아니 간다지 동해 차이는 주잖아요. 동해 뇌신도 동해 차이가 나지 쌓아야지. 그게인데 머리가 연구를.
So the third statement that because there is this fundamental confusion, volitional acts followed. Asanga, when commenting on that statement, talked about the further qualification that is needed for for a cause to produce an effect. And he referred to this condition as a condition of potentiality. And that is the idea that it is not enough or adequate for the cause to be existent, nor also to be impermanent, to produce a particular or specific result. It is not the case that everything can produce everything or anything. And there must be some kind of a concordance between causes and effects. There must be some kind of relationship, natural relationship. Therefore, because our state of existence is that of a suffering, although what we desire is happiness, but out of ignorance we create suffering. So therefore, the fundamental root of our existence is suffering. So there is a concordance between the state of the result and its cause. So all in all, there are three conditions: that the cause should be existent, it should be impermanent, it should be concordant with the effect or with the result.
Tene juda kenliya, ane ya namra nangsiga yawa munguji, mindawa munguji, shibchago ya shayayo mare. Da, da, bana nyenling jusaaro, tenjishijing jusaaro, da sungdengi ju. ane 개념 jusaaro shayayo da di tenjishijing jusaaro da kali nmendo shen, chende 어떤 레기다 귤레 만다다 또셔야 되어다 nyenling jusaaro.
So when in Buddhist analysis, when trying to understand the causal relationship between, say, ignorance and the volitional acts, what is required here is a sort of a complex understanding of the causal nexus. And here, of course, in the Buddhist scriptures, there are a lot of discussions of different types of causes and conditions. However, the principal sort of understanding of cause must be in terms of two types of causes. One is known as the material cause or the substantial cause, and then one is the cooperative conditions, the factors that assist in the causation. By material cause or substantial cause, we are talking about the very stuff that turns into the effect. So, you can talk about a physical continuum of a physical entity. It's the very stuff or the material that turns into the effect is the material cause. But you need many other factors that would allow that transition or that process to take place. So these are the cooperative causes or contributory causes, one could say. And similarly, when we talk about conditions, there are different ways in which conditions can affect a result. In the scriptures, there are, for example, of course, although these complexity in the ways in which conditions can affect a result may have more to do with the complexities of the operation of mind or functions of mind. However, we find in the scriptures there is a discussion of 5 types of conditions, such as the objective condition, which refers to the perceptive object. And then you have sensory faculties, like the organs that give rise to the perception. Then you have the immediately preceding condition, which is the earlier continuum of your consciousness, and so on. So you see there is a kind of complex understanding of the process of causation in Buddhism.
Jenny, when a yelling to Susan, when a may yelling to Slavina, Bajik Zadi, Korachi, trade payagi, they use trade payagi, Nubit, they use any, the main yelling shipment. And Meko Baba of Chicken yelling, Guamua. So Takora, Bajik Zadi Gane, Bayagi, because they use Yeviche, Nubit, they use Yeviche. That dination. Shebe ten Sheba Sheba Kirungi ten Galia, the huge sound down one Sunday. The Ampana Pamel Kudanama Young, so she was how great I got a yellow do. Checkada that ship and the Sheba Tara than a Chevy in it, and a Gong Sheba do Consulke, Gonga one de Modubodo, which he had never. The Nitikiag Nubajik, Zajic Shiva Tavetene, Kushapachi. And the Taki won't be tene, Yakurajik, sometimes matter.
So, for example, in the case of, say, let's take the example of fire. What would be the material cause or the substantial cause of the fire? One could say, that there is a potential existing within the fuel that is used to burn, make a fire, which then becomes the fire. So similarly, in the case of consciousness, perhaps the issue becomes more complex. For example, like, say, our sensory perceptions, sensory consciousnesses. Although what is needed, we need, it is obvious that we need the physical sensory organs in order for sensory perceptions to take place.
No. Nervous system.
Of course, this would also include the nervous system as the basis, the physical basis for the occurrence. So although in the traditional sort of classical Buddhist scriptures there is hardly any discussion of the nervous system, the systems of sort of the nervous system, perhaps this is something that needs to be added onto the Buddhist epistemological texts or Buddhist texts on psychology. And however, the substantial cause of the consciousness would not be these physical entities. The substantial cause of the consciousness has to be understood in terms of its own continuum, be it in the form of a potential or a propensity or whatever, but it has to be understood in terms of its continuum. So one could, although it is a very difficult sort of a topic, but perhaps one could say that one can understand. So one could understand in terms of the continuum of the subtle consciousness, because we should not sort of lead ourselves into a position where we end up implying that the material cause or the substantial cause of the entity or whatever it may be should be exactly the same, because we cannot maintain the position that the sensory perceptions, the substantial causes of sensory perceptions need not always be sensory perceptions, because sensory consciousnesses are gross levels of consciousness, and they are contingent to the physical organs of the individual being, whereas their continuum should be should be understood more at the level of subtle consciousness. So perhaps one could say that at a certain point they are in the form of potential rather than actual conscious states. So when we talk about consciousness or shepa, which is the Tibetan word, we should not have the notion that we are talking about one unitary sort of monolithic entity, something that is out there, or some kind of one entity. We must appreciate the complexity of the mental world. So within the realm of mental phenomena, it seems that feelings or sensations and thoughts are two sort of factors of mind which seem to be perhaps most predominant in our in our consciousness. So now let us try to sort of examine how do the feelings and how do the discursive thoughts occur within ourselves, within us. So when talking about feelings, of course, we are talking about two dimensions of an existence where one can speak about feelings purely at the physical level of sensations. But the more complex sort of issue is the trying to conceive or trying to understand feelings or torwa in terms of mental consciousness, the mental consciousness. And although, of course, one has to accept that there must be some connections with the nervous system of the body, but we must also be able to account for deeper levels of our feelings as well, sort of feeling, or one could say tones of experience. So here, of course, I'm pointing towards the sort of the nature of mental consciousness, the sixth mental consciousness. Here, I would like to point out that, of course, although the researches which are being undertaken now is quite few, but also at a very sort of elementary stage. However, there are experiments done on meditators. Although the experimental kind of sort of experimentations are very rudimentary or very elementary and at a very sort of early stage. However, these experiments are pointing towards a phenomenon which is perhaps difficult to account for within the current scientific paradigm. However, what they point out is that without any sort of physical change within the body, without any sort of movement, physical movement by the individual, simply by using the force of the mind through a single pointed state, these experiments have shown that one can affect the physiological states of the person. And these physiological changes that are taking place remain quite difficult to explain within the current sort of assumptions about the physiology of human being. Now, to me, what this point to is that although when we talk about human consciousness, when we talk about our consciousness, we are talking about a contingent phenomena. Of course, human consciousness is contingent upon the human body. All our experiences are contingent upon the human body. So there's human mind and human body are in some sense inextricable. Yet at the same time, what this seems to point out is the possibility or the possibility that human mind, the mind, although it's contingent on the body, however, has a sort of a power of its own, which by simply through reflection or meditation or training of the mind can be enhanced.
will singko lugi 직다디 직 nervous 직타는 요로 친신 will 기에버래 쉐보 코랑가 되는 will 세야지 직 좀zem도 삼단 드리지타는 will 세야지 기에버딘 파 가서 루자리아 파지 구조태야 주여버디 괜히 봐도다 무슨다 가서 거기에 식사네 배타야 돼. 다 will 깨다는데 다시 야는 고물을 시켜. 야는 지금 경제 싸움다. 근데 그 안에 그 will 게임이야 봐. sadadi shevatik nyalki shevatigi lulpa lug duter zedler pa kyotia yede with the.
And also we know that now within the modern medical discipline there's a growing recognition of the power of will in the process of healing, and how a will can affect the healing process. So there is a sort of one could say, effect by will on the physiology of the person. So that is a fact that is recognized even in the modern medical discipline. And also we know that, as to how will is developed, it could be a case where the person does a lot of thinking, and thinking about all sorts of reasons, all sorts of grounds, and so on and so forth. One can develop a strong will. Similarly, someone could develop such a will through meditation or whatever. So there seems to be an acknowledgement that will can affect physical change. But as to the question whether sort of a pure thought, as it were, can, what seems to be accepted is that whenever thought occurs, the thoughts can give rise to chemical changes, movements within the brain, which then is affected or expressed or manifested in a physiological changes and so on. But as to the question whether pure thought, can lead to such physical effects, or whether it is the case that whenever a thought occurs, it occurs as a result of a chemical changes within the body or brain, that seems to be an open question. And I've asked on several occasions to scientists and medical scientists as to whether it is possible for just to have a pure thought first, and then that thought processes can give rise to chemical changes, which then is affected at the physiological level. Most of the time, the answer seems to be that there is an assumption that because consciousness is dependent on consciousness is contingent upon a physical base, be it brain, that every occurrence of thought must necessarily be accompanied or be caused by chemical changes within the brain. But to me, that seemed to be more like a prejudice, rather than something that is experimentally proven.
So 더동아도 잡아쳐야 돼. 다 주저도 검장해줘. 다 검장으로. 검장 보는 거잖아. 즉 가서 그게 카이라요. 다 한번 해야 돼. 계속 해야 돼.
So here I think the question is still open, and so what is needed here is further investigation and experiment, particularly on the part of the practitioners, by engaging in profound meditations and to see whether these changes could be affected within oneself.
So, 당연히 낭배 제단데 다디 시베고 샤인도 전에 패지 나게 흉니 시베 시바 차라 이어와셔야다. 이 시바도 룽디 남샤셔야지 패지냐 판도 쳐보 주는데.
So when talking about the nature of consciousness and the functions of mind, I think explanations that we find in the Vajrayana literature, where there is a discussion of the existence of different levels of consciousness or different levels of or subtleties of mind, and their correspondence to subtleties of energy levels or pranas. I think these discussions or these explanations can contribute a lot to the Buddha's understanding of the nature of mind and its functions.
또 시발이야 당시情形있나? 아니 지금 남주 아주 시발어야 돼. 아니 가다지 치 지금 속져서 지금 다 당하지 통샤봐. 지금 다 텐데. 근데지 근데기 남발 샤데. 야나지 디두 노야 남발 샤데. 근데지 마도 코라 시바 코레 지 코란 가서 세상 직zam기 남발 코버리아 샤철기요 말이. 다 딩야를 차와지 토안에 시바 무엇이나 마도 디 시바 디 남발 마샤를 토안에 시바 무엇을 그냥 가고 그러셔.
So when we talk about the nature of consciousness, generally speaking, when we try to investigate ourselves through introspection, we find that this in our own experience, most of our conscious mind seem to be either states of consciousness that has to do with objects that we have experienced in the past, or some kind of recollections, past experiences inform our present consciousness, or it has to do with some kind of feeling or sensations. So our experience of consciousness tend to be predominantly pervaded by either discursive thoughts or feelings or sensations.
자, today in this 대외 직단 양용 근데 지금 참배리디에 결모주세 마음에 차고 남도 남들이 차고주세 아니 지 셰바코라 다대시 다대시바스니 고바 생각해요 말이지 가다시 대외 남도디 결모주세 마음에 지 드만나서디 차고주세니 근데 지금 안에 또 돼야 돼. 또 대도 것이다. 돼야 그 뒤인데 갈래 봐 검지고 관배왕래 링도 땅토나 남시나 아니 봐 시베 정신으로 봐 득된게 라지 유기 나버 나서 샷된게 라지 나버 나서 샷된게 아니 남도 우리도 봐도 봐 지가소리 세베 쉬대 아니 갈래 세점 직점 녀에等얘기 시베 정신고 갈래를 지금 못 해야지 이게 뭐였어요?
Sorry, I forgot something earlier. So, given that our consciousness experience of our consciousness is so dominated by discursive thoughts that has to do with objects or things, and then also our feelings or sensations, it is very difficult for us to actually have a glimpse into the actual nature of consciousness, which is the mere state of knowing or luminosity. So therefore, one technique that one can use is to sort of sit in a meditation, do a sitting, and then try to sort of free your mind from sort of thoughts of recollection of any past experiences or any form of anticipation of what might happen in the future, but rather try to sort of abide in the nowness or in the present state, although one cannot talk of present consciousness, but try to sort of free your thoughts or free your mind from these sort of thoughts which are directed towards past experiences or looking into the future in some kind of anticipatory way, but rather being concerned only with the now and here and then try to sort of keep that kind of intervening, if I can use the word, space. So when you are able to kind of, in some sense, clear away these sort of, looking into the past or anticipate, looking into the future, but rather, sort of abide within the present sort of now state, and then slowly one might begin to have a glimpse of a sense of sort of, a vacuum, a sense of kind of void, and that if one can extend that period of voidness sort of, for longer periods of time, then slowly and gradually the nature of consciousness, which is the mere luminosity and state of awareness, might slowly begin to dawn on you. And then through practice, that intervening period could be sort of lengthened and also so that the awareness of the nature of consciousness becomes clearer in your mind. However, one must know that this simply having this experience of the luminosity and knowing nature of mind in itself is not a profound realization. Because many of the formless realms are considered to be results of sort of abiding in such sort of states of clarity. However, using that initial experience of the luminosity of consciousness as a basis, then one can build up on that by complementing with other practices.
Janata, Tawandita, Tukdin said, this matter something. Tukdin said that the share of the
So this is how we can look at the Buddha's teaching on the truth of suffering in that kind of within that complexity.
Tadine Tungegi Tudi Moribali Chumari said Cheni. Tashine, that Tungegi Tudi in Shibjadi, that Kunju Damasat in some time.
So once you have developed that kind of recognition of the dukkha nature of our existence, then we also already have an understanding that at the root of our existence, sort of dukkha existence, is this fundamental confusion or avidya. And then this, of course, points towards the second truth, that is the truth of the origin of suffering. So we will leave at that.
Thank you. Good night. See you again tomorrow.